Okay, so today we're going to be starting the second part to Halachot Toal'im, and the title, first of all, it should be for the learning of merit of Rav Chachai Batzala. The title of this is known as the Miscellaneous Laws for Checking for Insects. Now, there's going to be a PowerPoint that's going to be supplied with this video. It's going to be embedded. So those who actually want to follow along with the lecture, it would be able to be follow along with the PowerPoint. Everything will be supplied. So now, I just going to provide one disclaimer that we're going to go through a series of the halachot. There's about 30 slides in total that goes through a number of aspects regarding the necessity to check, when to check, how to check, and all those things. But you have to understand that to actually go through the whole compendium of halachot regarding this topic, there's endless amount of hours that could be used to actually go through, and 30 slides is not going to do justice. That's without a doubt. But hopefully by the end of this, we're at least going to have a much greater idea of some of the concerns that's part of the necessity for checking for any bugs that may be found inside produce, and hopefully we'll be able to understand the severity of it as well. So without further ado, let us begin. So now, the very first thing we have to understand is something that we spoke about in the very first part of the series, that the minimum amount of isurim that a person is capable of being liable for punishment for every insect that is consumed is a minimum of 4 and a maximum of 6. And the reason that we get that number is because there are two general prohibitions that apply for the consumption of all insects. Two general prohibitions, and once we get to the specific types of insect in question, there might be more specific type of lavim that are being applied. So now, what are the specific ones? They're the general prohibitions that are having for consumption of insects. So there are two of them that are stated as follows. The first one is in Rosh Hashmini in Vayikra Yud Aleph, Pasuk Lamem Gimel. It says, a person should not make himself abominable, b'chol sheretz hasharetz, in any type of creeping creature, v'lo titmeu bahem, person should not defile themselves from them, and he's going to be unclean through them. So, essentially, the Gemara in Chulin, Daf Samach Zayin Amud Aleph, says that from this pasuk itself, is broken down two different aspects of consuming insects. Number one, a person should not make himself abominable, meaning that he shouldn't do something that itself would be considered repulsive. And that is the first Isur that comes along. And it's only in the latter half of the pasuk in which the second is brought down as well. V'lo titamu bahem, a person should not defile himself from them. So he shouldn't become impure from them. Meaning it doesn't make himself impure to the extent that he has to go to the mikvah, but rather it's as if his nefesh, right? The pasuk is stating his nefesh is becoming impure, meaning that his body and his soul in one whole is becoming it. So under this idea, we already see that there are two general prohibitions that refer to all insects that could be possibly consumed. Now, when it comes to aquatic insects, the sheretz hamayim, the Torah gives two more prohibitions involved. The first one is found also in the same parak in Yud Aleph and Pasuk Yud, so it's about 30 Pasukim earlier. It says, Kol asher en lo sempir b'kaskesed b'ayamim v'nechalim, and this is the Pasuk that we spoke about in the first part of the series when we spoke about the copepods in the NYC water. So this Pasuk is brought down there as well. It says, Kol asher en lo sempir b'kaskesed, any creature that does not have fins and scales, b'ayamim v'nechalim, whether in the seas or in the rivers, mikol sheretz hamayim, among all the creeping creatures in the water, mikol nefesh hachaya, among all living creatures, asher b'mayim sheketz halachem. He says, that which is found in the water, there will be a sheketz for you, there, an abomination for you. So even though there is no direct prohibition that actually says over here, you should not eat it, or you should not become defiled, or you should not become abominable. Nonetheless, it says that sheketz halachem, that they are abominable to you, therefore that is seen to be the source of the love, that this cannot be consumed, even though it's not stated explicitly it should not be done, the inference is that it should not be done. The second is found in Sefer Dvarim, Parak Yudal, Pasuk Yud. Kol asher en lo sempir b'kaskesed lo tilchalu tameh hu lachem. It says again, that anything that does not have fins or scales found in the water, lo tilchalu, over here we see explicitly it's mentioned, it should not be consumed, because it will be unclean and defiled for you. So if we take the first two, plus, which were the general prohibitions, plus the latter two, so 2 plus 2 is 4. And that's why if you have a person consuming any aquatic insect, that would be 4 lavim in total. Specific prohibitions for land insects.
And there will be, by the way, all the shrimps and this. It's not necessarily just like bugs, and it's everything that doesn't have.
Anything that doesn't have fins and scales.
Exactly. Anything that doesn't have fins and scales is under that. Shrimps, lobsters, etc. Eels, whatever it is. Yeah.
Now, specific prohibitions for land insects. Now over here we find that there are 3 of them that are mentioned, and all 3 of them are found in the same parsha, in Parsha Shmini, in Perek Yud Aleph, and they're found in nearly 3 psukim back to back. Pasuk Mem Aleph, Mem Bet, and Mem Dal. First pasuk, V'chol sheretz hasheretz al aretz sheketz hu lo ya'achel. It says, first of all, any sheretz that's creeping on the ground should not be consumed. That's in pasuk Mem Aleph. Then, pasuk Mem Bet. Lo tochalum. Further it says, regarding those creeping insects, it should not be consumed. And finally, 2 psukim afterwards, and pasuk Mem Dalet, Ki ani Hashem Elokechem v'yitkashtem v'yidem kedoshim. He says, I am Hashem your God. You shall be holy, ki kadosh ani, because I am holy. V'lo titmu et nafshetochem. And similar to what we found in the general prohibitions, a person should not defile his nefesh. So too, this is seen as the 3rd law regarding the pasuk. So therefore, when a person has a consumption of a land insect, you have the first 2 general prohibitions, the latter 3, which are going to be the specific ones for the land insects. So 2 plus 3 is 5. That's how we get 5 isum in total. And finally, we have the sheretz ha'of, which is the flying insects. So over here we only have 1 mention of it, also in Perek Yud Aleph in Parsha Shmini. It says, V'chol sheretz ha'of asher lo arba reglaim sheketz hu lachem. So it says that any sheretz ha'of, which is any flying insect which has 4 legs, with the exception of the grasshoppers, but that's a different subject, sheketz hu lachem. He said, this is an abomination for you. So only over here we find that there's a single pasuk that mentions it, but that does not mean that there's only 3 prohibitions. Because you wouldn't say there's the 2 prohibitions of the general plus 1 over here, because that would be the first 100 person would get. But rather what the Gemara tells us is that included in this is the other 2, or really the other 3 of the land insects. So you have the 2 general, the 3 that apply to the land, and finally 1 that applies to the sheretz ha'of. So 2 plus 3 plus 1, you get 6 total lavim, and when it comes to anything that flies. Okay, so now, the next subject is
what is coronavirus?
It actually does look good. Yeah, you can see the, right, that's just bacteria in general. So now, the size of the forbidden insects. So it is clear that the Torah required a minimum size for insects to be forbidden, below which would not pose a concern. So the Aruch HaShulchan family states that the microscopic insects, invisible to the eye, cannot be part of the prohibition due to the principle of lo natna Torah l'malchei hasharet. So he emphatically states that things that are invisible cannot be part of the prohibition, because if that would be the case, every time a person is breathing, there are microorganisms that are coming into his, through the nasal, through the oral cavity, and that for sure cannot be part of the isur that the Torah was wanting for. So therefore, we have to question what is the minimum size that is being regarded here. So over here, what we find is that there are really 3 approaches that could be taken. So the first approach is something that is currently identifiable, meaning that insects are only forbidden if they are currently identifiable in the current form with the naked eye. Meaning that you could tell the appendages, you could tell if there's antennas, you could tell that it has legs, and it could maybe even see the eye. You could see that this thing is clearly an insect without further questioning. And there's no necessity for using any types of tools that would use as magnification to whatever extent it might be. It wouldn't even have to be just a regular magnifying glass, but to anything that would have to aid the unaided eye, so that would be considered not currently identifiable. The second approach is that something that was once identifiable, an insect which was ever identifiable, even if it is subsequently impossible to recognize. So as long as in some stage in its life it was able to be seen, therefore perhaps there should be concern. But of course the question is, any speck that you found on a fruit or vegetable, seemingly you would have to be concerned for that, because you don't know whether it's being identified at some point, because you're not a person who's like bucking every type of insect to know whether this thing actually had a concern to be identified. So that becomes already a little bit more machmir as opposed to the first, in which it has to be only currently. And finally, the most machmir of all approaches is that it has to be visible. meaning even if it's not identifiable, but as long as something is visible, even if it's just a speck, and it was never able to be seen beforehand, that would be required to be removed as well. So therefore, any insect which is large enough that each individual insect can be seen without magnification, even if it was never identifiable. So, meaning the individual. Many times you're going to find that there's only after a cluster of insects that come together that it actually poses something that can be seen by the naked eye. But over here what we're saying is that's not the concern. It's only when each individual is being seen presently, as even if it's a speck, that would already be starting to show an issue. So now regarding the positions of the poskim, so they're really divided amongst this. And I'll be honest with you, when you actually go through their works, it's not exactly always clear when those who want to be makel, how makel are they? Are they most makel approach, or maybe somewhere more centrist? Or those who are more stringent? Sometimes you find the ones who are more machmer, those who are more machmer, they usually take also the middle approach, or perhaps even the most stringent, which is only the visible. So I gave a table over here, those poskim, the ones who are more modern, from the contemporary times, which position that they hold. I'll just run through it quickly. Those who hold that it's only if it poses a problem if it's currently identifiable. This is again the most lenient position, but nonetheless, even though it's the most lenient position, this does not mean that checking is not a priority. Of course, the thorough checking is still necessary according to all opinions. So now, this would include Harav Yisrael Belsky, Rav Yisrael Guzman, and Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski. Once identifiable, this is actually what we spoke about in the previous year when we spoke about the copepods. How Harav David Feinstein and Rav Hershel Schachter, they held that since copepods were once identifiable in the reservoir, we said that was an issue. So
don't forget, what size is the copepods?
Right, so they're about 1 millimeter.
1 millimeter, okay. Just read here, it's something which we all have at home. It's not a part of your presentation, just read it for the people to know.
Okay, so it says the house dust mites, due to their very small size and translucent bodies, right, so are barely visible to the unaided eye. A typical house dust mite measures 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters in length. For accurate magnification, one needs at least 10 times magnification. The body of the house dust mite has a striated cuticle. Okay, so that's pretty much almost invisible.
So according to
Almost
that,
invisible.
almost invisible. According to, it depends on which shita you go. So according to the more stringent shita, you will probably have to wear masks at home if you have carpets or if you have upholstered thing, or you actually sleep on your mattress.
Right. So now, the ones identifiable, we says Rav Hershel Schachter, Rav David Feinstein, the Chazan Ish, and Harav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And what's interesting is the most machmir approach is from Harav Moshe Vai. So he's known as writing a very interesting sefer, it's known as Bidikat HaMazon. And he was seen as being one of the foremost authorities of Toal'im in Eretz Yisrael. And he says in a number of places in his sefer that anything that is visible is already considered to be a concern. So now, most hashgachot follow the most lenient approach, which is only if it's currently identifiable. As mentioned in the first part of the series, the OU takes the middle stance. Again, not everybody agrees to this position. Now, local hashgachot differ in this matter, some being lenient while others are stringent, based on the rulings of the Rabbanim HaMachsharim. So, it really depends on the situation, but when it comes to more national hashgachot, they do tend to be more mekel, and only require something to be problematic when it's currently identifiable. And this leads to many machlokot you could imagine, but we'll skip through some of the things as we progress through the series. So now, regarding insects that crawl on the ground. It says in Yoredea, Siman Pedad, Halacha Vav, Toal'im dilim beperot be'odam be'mechubar chashuv kishoretz hal haaretz v'asur af al pi shelo pirash v'u sherechash. So now, the only time an insect is considered to be absolutely forbidden is when we're talking about for insects that came from the ground. Okay, this is true when they grew in the environment that was still attached to the ground. So as long as it's attached to the ground, meaning it's attached to the tree, it's attached to the ground itself, any fruit or vegetable in which it's that current status, that's when the Torah forbid it. And you're going to see that once it's detached, it has a completely different din. So it says that it has a status of being forbidden pretty much once it's born, and once it makes the slightest movement, even though it's in its current environment, it still poses a problem. So, if you could recall, we spoke about in the first part of the series, we said how insects that are found outside of the water, if they're found inside of pits and in cups and in mugs and in cisterns and water tanks, as long as they are in that environment, they are considered to be fine. Only once they leave to the outside, that seems to be problematic. We're going to see that the same thing is going to be true when we're talking about detached fruits. But once they're still attached, it's going to be an issue in any stage whatsoever. So once they're pretty much born, as soon as they start, moving even the slightest amount, that's when the problem already comes about.
Oranges.
So now, what are some lists of scenarios? And regarding the oranges, we're going to get back to that on a brief statement regarding the whole issue having squeezed orange juice and the Tropicana controversy. That there's going to be a little discussion regarding that as well. So a list of scenarios would be as follows. Even if the fruit was subsequently picked, it would not make a difference. If a bug was born inside of it, that already poses an issue. So Malan basically said the following, that when it's born inside of an attached fruit, when it's born inside of an attached fruit, it only becomes asur once it starts to wiggle, as soon as it makes the slightest movement. And just for the sake of discussion, he does say in the situation where the space inside is so tight that it would be impossible for it to even move, that would be considered fine. So he does give a certain leniency regarding it. But now, assuming theoretically that the insect never moved while it was still attached, then it became detached, and then it started moving, Malan still holds it's problematic. He still holds it's problematic because its starting point was already at the time of an Isur. It just didn't fully actualize itself, but it's still problematic. The second is if the insect was found on the exterior of the fruits, as we're going to see later on regarding the citrus scales found on citrus fruits. The image on the right is of an orange. And finally, an insect entered the fruit from the outside. That for sure would be problematic because its origins were from the outside. And the only time there's any question was when it came from the inside of the fruit, not from the outside. Okay? Now, a little more interesting when we get insects from detached produce. So, something that we spoke about again was Toal'im beperot betalush mutarim. So he says in Siv Dalet that regarding insects that are found to grow inside of the fruits when they were detached from the ground, they are permitted. And we said that this is true so as long as it hasn't left its environment. Meaning as long as it's still wiggling around the fruit and it hasn't left, it's still permitted. Now, last time we spoke about an interesting machlokes between the Rambam and pretty much all the other Rishonim, whether if it left after its death, is that considered problematic? The Rambam held that if it died and subsequently left its environment, came out of the fruit, it's still asur. He held it was asur. Now, I bolded for you over here that he says, he says there are those who say that he's calling the Rambam essentially, that's problematic even if it dies and comes out afterwards. But his stam is that's not the halacha. But what we see over here is that there is great reason to be lenient in many situations because of the fact that they're not prohibited when they come from detached produce. It's only when they're attached that they're prohibited. But if they're detached and that's where it grew, it's absolutely permitted. And this is the source of many leniencies that we're going to see coming up. Now, what in the situation would happen when a person finds a hole? So now, a person looks inside and there's a clear hole. And you know the insect is still inside of it. So now, do we assume that the insect left and came back because you still see it there, or do we assume it just nibbled its way out, but it actually never left? And do we assume that it would still have the kosher status according to the Shulchan Aruch? So there is underlined at the very bottom. That's where the discussion comes about. He says, he says, as long as you find the insect inside of the fruit, even though there's a clear hole that's protruding outwards, and that gives somewhat of visibility that's left, he says, so Maran, he's actually, seemingly, he's very makel here. He says, nonetheless, a person does not have to be concerned that it's left its environment and returned. But we assume that it's still retained its original place. The Ramah disagrees. He says, I disagree, respectively. If there is a hole, we do assume it left, and for some reason it came back.
That's, by the way, a slug hole that ate its way inside, like this, and then out.
And then out.
It came from the outside in.
Uh-huh.
I know it.
So now, there is discussion why the Ramah is machmir over here, because if we could recall from the first part of the series, we said that if an insect was inside of a cup, okay? Now, obviously a cup has a hole. So now if you find the insect inside of the cup, and we assume, it never left. It never left that environment. So the question is, according to the Ramah, he does agree if water is inside of a cup and the insect is found inside of there, we don't assume it left, but we assume that it stayed over here. How come regarding the fruit, we don't assume that? So the Shach answers, he says, because the fact that you find a hole means that it must have left, essentially. The fact that there's a hole there, it was deliberately trying to leave. It's not the same thing as when there's, a natural void inside of a cup. He says that would not be sufficient reason to assume, but once you find the hole, there's got to be more reason to suspect that it actually left. So that's why the Ramah is actually more machmir in this case. So now what happens when a person is in doubt? If one opens a fruit and finds insects inside, but does not know of its origins, he doesn't know whether it came from the time when it was attached or detached from the ground, it's assumed to be asur, and this is based on the principle of safek d'oraita l'chumra. And when a person is doubtful regarding a yisur d'oraita, this is a time when a person needs to be machmer, he has to be stringent, and discard it.
If the insect is found while it's attached, that makes it mutter, no?
When it's detached. When it's detached. Again, when it's talush. When it's detached, it's permitted. When it's attached to the ground still, attached to the tree, or attached to the ground. So that's what was called sheretz hasheretz al ha'aretz. Right? Even though it's not on the aretz, like the ground itself, but it's attached to the tree, which is attached to the ground. It's as if it's attached to the ground. So if we don't know the origins of the insect in question, we are machmer, we say it's a sudoraita, and that's discarded.
So in this case, you call the Ramah.
We have to discard the insect. I mean, you don't have to discard the whole fruit, assuming that you could check it. Okay. However, the Taz explains that in a situation where one knows for sure that the insects only originate in the specific fruit type when it's detached. You know for sure that the only times these things are actually infested is when it comes detached. That's the only problem. So he says that there is no need to check for the insects, but that's if one can absolutely ascertain that this is what happens. And he talks about the permissibility for consuming unchecked raisins. He says because the possibility for insects to actually attack the grapes while still attached to the vine is very slim, because grapes being a solid structure, it's less likely for it to be penetrated at the time. It would be more visible because there's no room for it to grow, unlike in a leafy type of produce. So he says that if you were to detach the grapes, so then you would essentially going to be drying them, producing raisins. So therefore, any insects that would come would only be when it was a raisin, when it's detached. So he says over there, there would be no reason to really check. And it's interesting, like he does allow for that. The Miscellaneous Zahav explains that it's based on number sfekot. So perhaps no insect is even found inside, and he says even if they are present, perhaps they're left and therefore permitted altogether. So essentially it's based on a double sfek, a sfek sfekat. And he says that for that reason the Taz is makel for that perspective. Now the status of mushrooms. So the Ramah has a very interesting comment. He says Toal'im hagdalim k'mehen u'pitriyot. He says regarding insects that are found inside of mushrooms. So we do know that mushrooms. He states the bracha from mushrooms is not hadamah, right? They're shakal because they don't grow from the actual ground, as the Gemara says. They don't get sustenance from the ground. And if that's the case, you would be able perhaps make the argument that if they don't grow from the ground, therefore it's not sheretz hasheretz al ha'aretz, right? It's not insects that come from the ground. So he says, don't assume that, but rather they have dinok mosh b'shar pirot. They have the status of all other types of fruits and vegetables. He says, v'lo amrina delo chashiki b'chumal karko hoyava en mevorchin lebor pri adama. Just because we don't say adama doesn't mean it doesn't have the status of those land-produced insects. That's not the case whatsoever, because when the Torah forbids anything that comes from the ground, it means anything that really has attached to some surface. It has nothing to do whether it comes from the ground itself. So he says for that reason, the status of mushrooms would be applicable to this as well. Then we find its relevance to the hydroponic grown produce. So now there's an interesting discussion found in the Sefer B'digad Mazon that we quoted earlier. He quotes Harav Shalom Zalman Auerbach, which stated that it is possible to equate the hydroponic grown produce to the Ramah's case of mushrooms. However, over there he does mention that more proof would be necessary before drawing such a conclusion. But he is willing to say that there might be a similarity between the two, and perhaps the Ramah would have equated to all situations. But it's not fully conclusive. Okay. So now, necessity to check in the 3 levels of infestation. So this is something that we spoke about in the first part of the series. There are a number of things I took from the first part because it repeats itself a number of times. We said that there are 3 levels of infestation, and each decreasing level was going to have a less of a necessity to check. So the first level is known as Halachot Toal'im, where experience has shown that a certain food during a particular season and place is likely to contain infestation in a majority of samples. So the necessity to check for bugs is a din d'oraita. So basically, if over 50% of the time this type of produce will have from its season and place this type of infestation, over 50% of the time it's a din d'oraita to check. Mita matzoi, where a significant minority of samples in a particular food is expected to contain infestation. Again, it's expected, but not certain. So the necessity to check is only a din d'Rabbanan. It's only din d'Rabbanan to actually check. What we're going to see is this law of checking for mita matzoi is learned from checking the lungs of a potential trefa. They actually are equated almost identical. The Rama quotes a Rashba that says that a lot of these things that we learn regarding the necessity to check, when it's, even though most likely not going to happen, is learned from the necessity to check for lungs. Because the idea is that just as most animals, presumably they don't have any like scar tissue inside of the lungs, nonetheless, there's what's known as the mita matzoi. There is this significant minority that do have these lesions, and therefore there is a din d'Rabbanan to actually check all animals, the livestock that actually have potentially a scar tissue. But there are leniencies that come to there as well. Finally, the last one, experience has shown that only an insignificant minority has proven to be infested. Checking for insects is not required, but it's praiseworthy. The Chayyad says a number of times in his Sefer that he's been saved from many Yisurim because he nonetheless took the more machmir approach and actually checked them and found insects, lo and behold, to have been there. So the question is, what is considered the significant minority for one to be concerned, below which threshold there is no need to check? So we spoke about last time as well that there are 3 opinions. The Rivash, which is the most mekel, he says that if it's slightly shy of 50% of the time, his own words is karov l'mechatzeh. If it's close to half, which we assume is somewhat closer to 40% to 50%, around that range, that would be considered a good enough minority. Anything less than that, there would be no need. So that would really remove a lot of produce that we have today, because many of them are below that 50% threshold. However, others disagree and they take more machmirim approaches. First of all, is the Mishkan Yaakov. He says the threshold is 10% of the time, which is clearly much lower. And Sheva Levi, who says even 0.5% of the time, which is 1 in 200, which is
impossible.
Very, very difficult. You probably try to check everything. The halakha consensus follows the Mishkan Yaakov, so therefore the threshold is always 10%. Question is, what 10% of what? Rosh Zalman Auerbach held that 10% of a standard unit would be the criteria. So whatever we considered the bunch in which it comes, when people buy them in bulk, that would be considered to be the standard unit. Different kasha agencies provide different units. For more information, you should definitely check the OU manual for checking fruits and vegetables, because it goes through lists of what would be considered the standard unit for each type of produce and the frequency of occurrence over there for each one. Rabbi Hershel Shachli, he takes a different approach and argues against this. He says that it depends not on the standard unit, but on the serving size. So if you have a handful of grain, right, and that would be considered a serving size. So if you would have 10 handfuls of grain, if one of them would be found in each handful, that would be considered mita matzoi. The halakha says it does not follow Rav Shachli's approach. It's rather of Zalman Auerbach's, and therefore we go by standard units and not by serving sizes. You should know, even with the whole serving size, there's also machloka regarding that, because some do hold it's on average, some say it's subjective to the amount that they ate, but that's not relevant at this point. Exceptions from miut she'en matzoi. So now, even though we said that anything in which is below that 10% threshold, the person does not need to check. That's not always accurate. Sometimes, even when it's miut she'en matzoi, even when it's below that 10%, there's still an absolute necessity to check. And basically, in Sif Yud, he talks about a situation where a person cooked vegetables. He cooked vegetables, and generally speaking, we assume that once something's been cooked, everything inside it dissolves, and therefore whatever was there has completely disintegrated and no longer found. So therefore, we could equate that cooked vegetables would be something like a miut she'en matzoi, because that pretty much would be the case. However, Malan says that if you were to cook the vegetables and then you were to find 3 live insects over there, or not live insects, but 3 insects inside that are completely whole, Once you find 3 of them, there's a concern that it's already Halachot Toal'im, and therefore the din to check is actually a din d'oraita, and therefore you would have to inspect every single piece, the whole part of it, until you remove everything, because now there's a chazaka that's actually found. So even if you were to take a fruit or vegetable in which we assume that almost never it has any insects that has part of the infestation, once you find 3 of them, you have to do an absolute thorough checking. But before you get to that 3 insect threshold, if you found only 1, for instance, there's no need to do that thorough checking. So once 3 is found, that's when it comes down. Some relevant laws for checking. So it says, any food that requires a checking may not be sampled, but rather every piece needs to be checked. That's a din that the Ramah has. So he gets it from the Rashba. So the Ramah learns this law from the Rashba, who requires all animals in a farm to be checked for possible lesions in the lung. Well, one is not allowed to rely on the majority.
Of course, that's only if you checked it, not only upon checked it.
So, as we said earlier, that the necessity to check, the Torah doesn't require a person to check for the lesions. We assume that since most animals don't have the status of terifah, therefore there's no need midoraita to check. The Rashba, however, says that din d'Rabbanan, a person has to check, and his reason is very interesting. He says, the reason that a person must check for these lesions is because since it's right there in front of you, it would be considered like a bizayon not to check it. Because it's like you're disgracing the mitzvah. It's not a big deal for a person to go feel the lung if it's placed right in front of his face. And the same thing is true over here. If you have something in front of you, or the vegetable, and therefore the insects are found right there, for you to check is a necessity, because not to do so would be considered like a bizayon, and the fact that you just don't care about the mitzvah of removing the bugs. So from here the Ramah learns that sample checking is not allowed. We can't just take a percentage and say, okay, 70% of my animals, they're found to be fine, and therefore the remaining 30% should also be true. You don't do that.
In other words, if you, for example, have a box of, let's say, lettuce, right, a whole entire box, and you're going to say, okay, I'm going to check 3 lettuces out of the thing, and therefore I'll be machshir the rest of that, that's not acceptable. And that's unfortunately what some kosher agencies do. They do sample checking.
Right, so now, there are those who disagree with the Ramah's position. This is brought down from Harav Shlomo Kluger. He argues that one cannot compare the cases for 2 reasons. So number 1, he says that one animal's lesions on lungs or lack of do not reflect on another's. Basically, the fact is like this: that the fact that one animal has some sort of a health problem does not reflect on another animal. I mean, yeah, you could argue maybe if it comes from the same fodder or food that they're going through, but the assumption is that there's a biological problem with the animal, therefore that does not reflect. But when it comes to vegetable infestation, or lack of it, one produce could potentially reflect on another, but that would only be true if they come from the same place, if they come from the same farm and the same harvesting time. Therefore, finding infestation in one area would presumably reflect on another, because they tend to scatter. They don't tend to be localized in one area. But if they come from different places, obviously there would be a necessity to check, because one cannot reflect on the other. So Rosh Shlomo Kluger's position himself, he argues against himself essentially. He says, what I'm saying right now is essentially a kula. It can only be done in an absolute necessity when there's no feasible way to check every single thing. And it's based on that kula of Rosh Shlomo Kluger, in which corporations and restaurants, they allow methods of sampling which are permitted based on his leniency when all produce checking is unfeasible. So it is important to know that even then all produce is thoroughly cleaned. It is thoroughly cleaned. And then the sample checking. How the sample checking is being done, it really depends on the situation, because sometimes, like as the Rav was saying, when it comes to lettuce, they would check about 3 of them, and that those 3 would be a reflection on the cleanliness of the others. But when it comes to larger corporations, they actually have statisticians come and they actually make out a whole mathematical chart of what would be considered a reasonable suggestive sample. So it's not always like 3%, sometimes it's 30%, 15% of the things that they check through, and then only then they say, okay, this would be considered mathematically, statistically good enough for us to actually say that this could be a good representation of everything else. So how they go is very difficult mathematics involved, but it's based on this kula, that sometimes when the necessity is being given, that a leniency of that Rav Shlomo Kluger is bringing down can be used. But this may not be performed at one's own home. It's only when the checking is unfeasible because of the great quantity that's being presented. So is there any specific exclusive method a person should use? Is there like one thing you got to do and then that would be feasible for all types of checking? So what's very interesting is if you actually look at the Shulchan Aruch when he talks about the need to check. First of all, the very first half of the Siman, he doesn't talk about the methods of checking. He doesn't go through that at all. He just talks about what's permitted, what's forbidden, what's permitted, what's forbidden. Only after then, the latter half of the Siman, he actually talks about methods that would be considered good enough to actually use on a day-to-day basis. And you would think that if you were the Shulchan Aruch, how would you voice your idea of actually stating the necessity to actually check? You would say, okay, a person should look for everything at a light, perhaps. However, he doesn't do that. He doesn't say a person should actually check. But what he does is he talks about a situation in which there's a concern that maybe there are certain beings that a person had that's been infested. And what he talks about is that a person should do some sort of a check in which he immerses these beings in water, and then whatever comes out, that's pretty much floating to the top because of the air bubble, that would be considered, identifiable as something that's problematic and infested, and those are removed, and the rest are cooked, and everything else is kosher essentially. So he gives a very technical way at the very first halakha of how to actually clean it. So from here, what you find is that there is no exclusive method of checking, particular vegetables, but every single thing, whatever works for it, is what works for it. Whatever is considered the new cutting edge, way of checking things, that is considered absolutely appropriate. Whether it's mechanical, whether it's going to be by person's own hands, whether a person is doing some sort of, experiment, that is considered fine as long as it's reasonably, accepted. Whose checking is reliable? So both men and women which are above the age of bar mitzvah are relied on to check for insects, provided they are aware of this type of infestation and check patiently and effectively. So the Shach and the Pri Mekadim, they make a very big deal on this, saying that if you're going to have the woman checking, she only has the chazakah that she's capable of doing so in this situation in which they do it with a lot of care, a lot of attentiveness, and constantly placing a lot of emphasis on everything and not just doing things quickly just to get away with the chore. Anyone who is a minor may only do so for food that is not Halachot Toal'im, so only if there's a din derabanan to check, would a person who's a katan be allowed to do so. Non-Jews are not relied on. One who disregards these halachot are also not relied on, so even if a Jew, if he doesn't care about it, clearly this doesn't work. And of course, one is allowed to check with the aid of glasses. But once you talk about magnification, that's where you get into other areas of question whether it's even necessary to do so. The day regarding finding insects in a mixture. So now, a whole insect, which is known as a bria, if it's lost in a mixture, if you have a whole insect that's lost in the mixture, so the whole mixture becomes forbidden, because when it comes to a complete insect, a complete creature, it's not nullified even in 1,000 times. Even at 1,000 times, 10,000 times greater than that, that's not sufficient enough for it to be mevatel. So it says in Sefer Kreativ Apleti from the Yavetz, he actually goes to this whole back and forth questioning whether an insect has the din of bria or not. And the reason is because the din of a bria, it's actually a fascinating discussion, is the din of bria only applies to animals and creatures in which were from its onset forbidden, meaning from its very creation, from the time it came into this planet. Once it was born, if it was usher, it has a din of bria forever. So what he wants to argue is that since insects, technically speaking, in a situation where they came from, let's say, a detached fruit, or when they were outside of a natural body of water, they were permitted at some point, and only afterwards, once they left that environment, they were considered forbidden. He wants to argue that perhaps, therefore, that would be a reason for it to assume that insect would not be having the din of bria. However, he himself says that I myself would not rely on my own kula, because this is just like for theoretical knowledge, and to assume that is the halacha, he says that would not be possible unless an extreme need with other types of leniencies. But that's not accepted in the halacha l'maaseh. And everyone does agree. Essentially, the insects have the din of bria for that reason. This would be true even if the insect is difficult to find due to camouflaging or having lodged within the many folds of a produce. So that was, of course, the status of broccoli and things of the sort, in which, because of the many folds that it comes in contact with, it would be difficult to find. Can one nullify an infested mixture? So insect fragments are batal b'shishim. So even though a whole insect is not batal, even in 1,000, once it's fragmented, broken up, and chopped up, they are batal in 60 parts, as is commonly found with other issues would come regarding forbidden mixtures. However, one may not intentionally chop, grind, or puree any problematic vegetables when done to ensure that a bitul has taken place. So if a person is lechatchila doing some sort of chopping in order to ensure that a bitul is going to happen, that is forbidden because it's in line with the dictum of ein mevatlim asur lechatchila. One is not allowed to lechatchila from the very onset do something that's going to be for the sake of nullifying a mixture. And if one were to do so, the one who violated and those who they are preparing for are not allowed to consume or partake of it. However, others may do so, but only those for which it was intended for, and the perpetrator himself, is not allowed to take part of that mixture. When is nullification allowed? So the poskim allow one to puree the problematic food if the following 4 conditions are met. So this is brought down by the Shach Taz and Pri Megadim. They bring this a number of times throughout the discussion. It says the following. So number 1, the food in question is not muhzak b'tolim, meaning that there's no din d'oraita to check. It's only if it's between 10% to the 49% time in which the infestation happens, that's when there's a necessity. That's the first qualification. Number 2, proper checking is impossible because due to perhaps camouflaging or the many folds that is there. The recipe calls for puree, basically essentially saying that it's not that I want to be mevatel. I don't want chopped bugs. That's not what I want. I want chopped food, and it happens to be that the chopped bugs is coming along with that. And the fourth is that there's no clear alternative that is available. No clear alternative is available. Now, in the situation where you have food that is Halachot Toal'im, so this means that it is a din d'oraita to check 51% of the times it's invested. So a very thorough check must be done if applicable. So if it's not applicable, therefore you can't puree it at all. But when applicable, if a very thorough check and cleaning is done. For instance, if a person wants to mash strawberries or something of that sort, in which it's Halachot Toal'im, over 50% of the time there's going to be infestation that's lodged inside of the seeds inside, or perhaps even more internal. So a person would have to do an absolute thorough checking, a thorough type of washing, and once he does that, he basically brings the level of chances of infestation to a much lower extent. Meaning prior to the actual washing and checking, the infestation level of this strawberry in question maybe 60%. But once he washed it and checked it and did everything, he brought it down to 30%. Since it's now at 30%, now it's only considered what? It's not muhzak b'tolim, it's only miut that has a matzoi. Therefore, since he brought it down to the din d'Rabbanan, now he's allowed to apply those 4 situations. Again, it's not muhzak b'tolim, proper checking is no longer possible, so he did everything he could, and he's doing it for the sake of making the puree for the recipe. That's when it's permitted. But before that situation, that cannot be done. Only after thorough checking, thorough washing has been done, and everything possible could be done, only afterwards could a person actually go and do so. So more ideas on nullification. The taste of insects becomes nullified in a mixture, and the food remains its permitted status. If the food was cooked with an insect and the insect was found and removed, the food is still permitted because, again, the taste imparted is for sure less than 60 times. The vessel used to cook is permitted as well. There's a discussion amongst poskim whether this would constitute the melacha of borer done on Shabbat. Meaning if you would have a situation where you have, let's say, a fly inside of your soup, right? We would remove all of the fly and actually pose the thing. The Taz says it's not. Most poskim actually agree with the Taz, saying that's not an issue for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that he does bring down is the fact that some of the soup ends up being along with the actual with the fly, however many it might be. So there's an interesting discussion on that, but that's not really relevant to this. Regarding juicing. Juicing is permitted as well for fruits or vegetables liable to be infested as long as a suitable filter is used. Now, there was an interesting discussion regarding the tropiconic controversy because what they ended up finding, not in the plants themselves. In the plants themselves, they use great filtering. And the filtering we're talking about is on the level of microns. Maybe 100 to 200 microns. We're talking about something smaller, like in a millimeter level. So what they found was, a number of people, they started using even smaller filters, and they found these citrus scales, which are about 50 microns large, which again, they're extremely tiny. And the Tropicana themselves, they weren't even aware of it. And people were complaining to them and saying that we're finding these insects and you're not doing a good enough job. So there was a question whether Tropicana is prohibited because of the fact that these insects were found when greater filtration was used. So the question was, is this problematic or not? So the CRC, the OU, and most other kosher organizations say that that is no issue because those citrus scales are found. First of all, they're indistinguishable. I mean, you really cannot see them. The size of them is so small, and the prevalence of them actually coming down is also it's a Meyuchein Matsui, so therefore there was really no issue. Some of them were machmir, but for other reasons that are not here for now. The produce should be checked prior to the juicing, so even though this is a permitted method of doing things, nonetheless, checking should be done l'chatchila. So regarding unchecked foods that require checking which were unchecked may not be consumed. So if it needs to be checked, one didn't do so, cannot be consumed. If the food that was cooked or baked, so if possible to check, so once you already fully cooked it or baked it, if possible to check, one must do so. Now, as we said earlier, 3 and 6 were found. So basically you got to remove it from the entire mixture. You look through the whole mixture to ensure nothing remains. If doing so is not possible, the entire food is forbidden and one may only strain the liquid part and consume it, leaving behind any solids. If impossible to check, it completely dissolved inside, there's nothing that can be done. If the food was under the category of Meitam Etzoy, one may be lenient on account of a sveka, that perhaps A, there were no bugs, and B, even if there were, they've been crushed and dissolved into the mixture. This is brought down by the Taz and the Mishpat Zahav. They explain this at length. And however, if the food under question is under the category of Halachot Toal'im, right, so now you can't find it, and 50% of the time or more, it's actually there. The food is prohibited since there is only a single safek. It's not that maybe it's there, maybe it's not there. It has a chazaka, it's there. So the only question is whether it's been, dissolved or not. Since only a single safek remains, therefore we say safek d'oraita l'chumra. Therefore a person's machmer. Therefore, for example, given preserves made from whole strawberries without being checked may not be eaten because you're only assuming one safek is over here. Finally, we had the preservation of insects. So now, something that we missed out, I kind of skipped it over, but the Shulchan Aruch brings from the Gemara that says that insects are capable of being mitkayim for only 12 months. Okay? This question, what exactly that means. So does it mean that they can only survive for 12 months? And the consensus is that essentially insects, if they're found inside of food, after 12 months they kind of decompose and they're considered like a farbalma, they're like dust. So if that's the case, after 12 months, if you have food that's been completely sealed, sealed off from all, contamination from the outside. So that food no longer requires to be checked because even if something was there, it completely broke apart and therefore it no longer poses a concern. However, if you have infested food that has been stored and sealed for 12 months, it may be eaten. If new insects would be able to get in, of course this leniency would not apply. If the food was preserved in a way that would facilitate the preservation of the insect, the food needs to be checked. So if some preservative was used, even though 12 months happened, we assume the preservative expanded the life and the ability for this thing to thrive, even past the 12-month range. There's an interesting discussion amongst the poskim. If you have a shana me'uberet, do you need to do 12 months or 13 months? If you have like the second other, right?
I have another assignment for you, but that's later on.
Right, okay. So now, there's a discussion whether 13 months would be required in Shana Me'uberet. You would think it should have nothing to do with it. I mean, the biology of the snake requires 12 months. What does it care if we already know the other? It could be that because maybe the prolongation of another season was going to do something. Maybe it had something to do with along those lines. It's not a clear thing. Some argue yes, some argue no. But the point over here is that once you have preservation occurring over here, that's when you have to assume that even after 12 months, the problem is still being posed. So some examples that are given is if you have insects inside of honey, salt solutions, vinegar solutions, and other preservatives. And this is brought down in Shulchan Aruch and Halachot Toal'im. Thank you, and any questions?
What's up, bro?